Good morning again from the Big Tent down in Denver. We are ready to begin another one of our panel discussions. Before we do, none of this could happen, obviously, without sponsorship. You're going to see a lot of sponsorship signs up here today, but I'd like to thank some repeatedly because they've really made a lot of this happen behind the scenes as well. Dig, where you can see behind me, Google and Echo Driving USA. We'd like to thank them very much for their help with this and for help bringing it on. And also, I'm going to bring this up frequently because I want everybody to see what this amazing place is doing. Go in between events, in between sessions, do what you can. And obviously, everybody's blogging in as well, but go to sustainablecolorado.org. You'll see it here on my right. Check out the site, check out what these guys are doing here, and plug into what they're doing and support them. Now, in the meantime, I'd like to bring up Nathan James. He is here from Washington, D.C. He is the campaign coordinator for the Media and Democracy Coalition. The Media and Democracy Coalition works with the media reform organizations to coordinate state and local national campaigns. Nathan's going to guide us from here, and welcome, Nathan.
All right, thanks a lot, Douglas. Thank you. So we're going to spend the next 4 hours talking about the critical intersection between our media system and our democratic system of governance. So connecting what happens on TV, broadcast radio, cable television, now the internet, maybe even mobile phones. So the Coalition is an organization that brings together 24 public interest national organizations and also local grassroots organizations to elevate the public's voice in the making of telecommunications and media policy. So basically telling people that they have a stake in the future of communications. So without any further ado, I want to introduce you to the president and CEO of a Coalition member organization called Common Cause. They've been working tirelessly on these issues, also clean elections, any number. This is Bob Edgar, Reverend Bob Edgar, who has come to us after spending 12 years serving the state of Pennsylvania in the U.S. House of Representatives and many other spots. So thank you very much, Bob.
Good to be here. One or two.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Are you awake? We have an exciting day here planned for all of us to talk about media and democracy issues. And I want to begin by quoting two of my heroes, which helped to shape why we're here and why we're talking about the issues of democracy and media being connected. The first was Bobby Kennedy. In 1966, Bobby Kennedy came away from looking at apartheid in South Africa, and he said this: "Let no one be discouraged by the belief that there is nothing that one man or one woman can do against the enormous array of the world's ills, against misery and ignorance, injustice or violence. Few will have the greatness to bend history itself, but each of us must work on a portion of events so that in the total of all those acts will be written the history of our generation." My second hero was Dr. Martin Luther King. I met Dr. King 5 weeks before he was assassinated. And Dr. King reminds us of the importance of this moment when he said, "We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of this generation, but for the appalling silence of those of us who are the good people." We're called to this moment to recognize that if we don't get it straight in terms of public media, we're all in trouble as people. I'm Bob Edgar. I was a member of Congress for 12 years. I was one of the Watergate babies. At age 19, I was a United Methodist pastor. I spent 10 years as president of a graduate school in California. For 7.5 years, I was general secretary of the National Council of Churches. And 1 year ago, I became president of Common Cause, that organization that was founded by a moderate Republican. You remember there were moderate Republicans. His name was John Gardner, and if you have a chance, Google John Gardner and read some of his books. Read his book on leadership, read his book on morality. John Gardner's words in the late 60s, early 70s are relevant for this time. And Common Cause has membership across this country, and we're revising and renewing ourselves to speak truth to power and to hold power accountable. And Common Cause wants Democrats, Republicans, and independents to work together to transcend party rivalries and collaborate. And no issue is more important than they collaborate on than the issue of media and media diversity. And that's why we're excited about the forums today, the workshops that will take place later this afternoon. I have the privilege of introducing a Federal Communication Commissioner, one of the good guys. Jonathan Adelman has been, Adelson, bad Bob. But remember, I did get add-ons. Anyway, Jonathan has been a good guy working on all of the issues that we care about, on getting the internet right, getting communications right, working on diversity issues, and he looks forward to working with a new president, a new administration, and a revised Federal Communication Commission to work on many of the issues that we care about. So let me introduce him by just quoting one of my other favorite people of the past, and I'm going to paraphrase his words, and that is Hubert Humphrey. I think some of you will remember this quote, but let me tinker with it a little bit. Hubert Humphrey, if he were here, would say this: the moral test of the public media would be how they serve the interest of the children in the dawn of their life, the elderly in the twilight of their life, and all of those in the shadows of life, the poor, the sick, and the disabled. Jonathan, as a commissioner, has cared about children, cared about the elderly, and cared about all of those who have been left out of the communication network. Join me in welcoming Commissioner Jonathan Adelson.
Thank you, Bob. Good to see you. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out this early. Some of you were out late last night, like me. It's an honor that you would show up to discuss these issues that are so crucial to the future of this country. And of course, I want to thank you, Bob, for that kind introduction and for all that you do. The leadership that you've shown for Common Cause is really reinvigorating it as a force and making a huge difference for this country. So thank you for doing what you do. And of course, everybody who sponsored this event this morning, the Center for Independent Media, as well as Common Cause, the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. Really wonderful to have a chance to talk about media democracy, an issue that's so near and dear to my heart. I think it's appropriate that we're doing it here in the big tent, of course, because there's one tent I'd like to see just a little bit bigger, and that's the number of Democrats on the FCC. We need some change you can believe in. Now, America itself, of course, is a big tent, and so is the Democratic Party. Media justice is about preserving that big tent, the public space where different and often competing ideas, views, and perspectives really battle it out in what has been called the loud noise of democracy. In America today, there is a fight going on for media democracy, and the FCC is at the center of the storm. We're charged with serving the public interest, but I think we've really fallen down on the job in the last 8 years. We really haven't done everything we need to do to fulfill our charter, and I'll get into that. Really central to our democracy is what the Supreme Court called the uninhibited marketplace of ideas, where everyone can exchange their views, music, news, information, entertainment programming over the public airwaves. The Supreme Court itself stated that it is the right of the public to receive suitable access to social, political, aesthetic, moral, and other ideas and experiences. Now that idea is enshrined in the First Amendment to the Constitution, and it's our job to make that come to reality. We're not only precluded at the FCC from abridging the rights of Americans to exchange ideas, we're also obligated to have rules in place that protect the exercise of those rights. Unfortunately, in recent years, the FCC has failed to protect your interests. We've forgotten that the public airwaves belong to the American people. We've forgotten that it's the public interest that's paramount, not the special interests that we oversee. We've forgotten that the ownership of the media is fundamentally about our democracy. It's about the music and the news we listen to on the radio and news and information, entertainment on TV. It really shapes the way we view our own country. These days we hear a lot about the importance of spreading freedom and democracy around the globe. Well, how about improving the quality of freedom and democracy right here in America? So I'll touch on some issues that you all care a lot about, that Common Cause and all of the sponsors here today have shown a lot of great leadership on. Our media ownership rules, minority ownership, and network neutrality. Some say with all this new media, we have the bloggers downstairs, some of you managed to come up here and join us, that why does the FCC even bother overseeing TV and radio anymore? Aren't there plenty of voices already? Well, I'll tell you why. Because the broadcast media, and the so-called MSM, the mainstream media, still has a booming voice with huge influence over our culture, political system, and the ideas that inform the public discourse. Study after study has shown that broadcasting is still the dominant source, not just of local news and information, but also entertainment programming, which shapes the dialogue. The broadcast industry still produces, disseminates, and ultimately controls the news, information, and entertainment programs that most inform the discourse, debate, and free exchange of ideas that is so essential to our participatory democracy that we are here in Denver to exercise our rights to engage in. Media ownership is about the power to control the public airwaves. Now, Congress charged the FCC with authority over broadcasting to foster diversity and localism and to prevent undue concentrations of power. But over the years, the FCC has really pursued a reckless deregulatory policy that has led to unprecedented levels of consolidation and concentration in ownership of the media and in the production of what goes out over the media. And correspondingly, we've seen a decrease in the public access to the public airwaves. When you look at today's national broadcast media landscape, we see hyper-commercialism, rampant homogenization, and an unforgivable lack of women and minority ownership, employment, and participation. When it comes to local newscasts, they're dominated by sensationalism and crime stories. There's little useful information, and even less government information and election information that people can use to make thoughtful decisions in a democracy. Now, this year we've seen a lot of coverage of the presidential campaign, but you can bet that when it comes to what's happening in your local elections, it's virtually a blackout in the broadcast media. You see almost no information about that. Real news is replaced with breaking gossip. Both local TV and national media are cutting news staffs, requiring fewer writers, reporters, and producers to do more with less. And news quality has obviously suffered. If it bleeds, it leads approach to news reporting might be good for ratings, but it's the very democracy itself that bleeds when the real information isn't conveyed, when the positive aspects of our communities aren't covered, when in-depth coverage of local and national elections disappear, and when real investigative journalism is replaced with video news releases. Now, instead of attempting to expand media ownership and diversity, in 2003, the Commission attempted the most dramatic rollback of the rules in the history of American broadcasting. I see Johanna Shelton's here. She was with me during that fight and wrote with me one of the great dissents of all time. I think it was 500 pages, was it? But it formed the basis for what was really a tremendous victory in the federal courts. It was Commissioner Copps and I who stood up and said that we can't let one company own in a single community 3 TV stations, 8 radio stations, the cable system, and the only daily newspaper, and the biggest internet provider. We even eliminated one of the few rules on the books to help promote women and minority ownership. Well, fortunately, our ill-fated 2003 decision was rejected by Congress, the courts, and the public. And thanks to a lot of the efforts of people here, including Common Cause, who is at the forefront of all this, we heard from 3 million people from the left to the right and virtually everybody in between that weighed in to oppose that decision. And the U.S. Senate voted on a bipartisan basis to reject the order and to have us start from scratch. And finally, as I said, thank God, the court overturned it, using our dissent as a basis, among other things. It was really with that ruling that we delivered an historic victory to the media reform movement and the American people. We stopped one of the most politically fearsome industries in America dead in its tracks. As many of you know, of course, last December we revisited that 2003 decision. And with the efforts of millions of Americans and congressional leaders like Senator Obama and Senator Clinton, the Commission reversed itself, deciding against modifying 5 of the 6 media ownership rules. And that was a tribute to all of the public effort that went into this. But the one rule that was modified, the newspaper broadcast cross-ownership ban, was one of the most important in this fight. It prohibited the dominant newspaper from being able to purchase a full-power TV station in the same market served by that newspaper. So one of the most troubling aspects of this decision was that we didn't deal with the problems created by past media consolidation. Before allowing greater concentration, we didn't deal with the loss of localism. We didn't deal with the loss of diversity. Allowing newspapers to merge with broadcast outlets only takes more opportunities further out of reach of women and people of color, people who are from that local community, and it further raises the exorbitant price of station ownership, which is really the biggest barrier to diversity. So while fewer companies are gaining more and more control over the means of distributing ideas, fewer small businesses, fewer members of the creative community, fewer African Americans, Latinos, and Asians, and Native Americans can use the airwaves to contribute to our national experience and to have their own unique voices heard. If you think about it, women make up over half of the population, but they own less than 5% of the TV stations in this country. And racial and ethnic minorities make up a third of the population, but they own less than 3.3% of all TV stations. So we have some major work to do. As the gatekeeper of the public airwaves, the Commission has a solemn obligation to ensure that all Americans have the opportunity to own, operate, and control broadcast outlets, not just to lease them. The very founding charter of the FCC requires us to protect the public interest by promoting competition, localism, and diversity. It requires us to take affirmative steps to prevent discrimination on the basis of race, gender, religion, or nationality. We're also supposed to take affirmative steps to promote ownership, because in America, ownership itself is the key to having your voice heard. Yet despite these abysmal numbers in terms of the diversity of ownership, the Commission didn't even acknowledge the disappointing state of minority ownership in the 2003 decision. And to make matters worse, it repealed the only policy on the books to help. Well, we've had way too much of this consolidation. We can't afford to let it go any further. And because we've refused to define broadcasters' public interest obligations, investors on Wall Street and advertisers on Madison Avenue dictate the images your children see, and those images define our dreams for the future. It's disappointing to see the tax certificate was repealed because it was so effective. And we're hoping that we can get that reinstated, that with new vigor and new administration can get a tax certificate back into the act, because it was one of the best steps that Congress ever took to improve the diversity of ownership. Of course, on the FCC, we missed an enormous opportunity to increase minority and female ownership in the recent auction of so-called 700 megahertz. That's the old TV analog channels that we're transitioning over, and we sold them off. They call it the greatest auction, perhaps, for generation to come. But instead of seizing on that opportunity to deal with this legacy of discrimination, we made a bad situation even worse, because women and people of color were virtually shut out from that auction and from the opportunity to own the airwaves. So we've taken some positive steps in recent months, but we've got a long way to go to increase minority and female ownership. There's a legacy of discrimination that we have a moral responsibility to redress. And I hope we can address this in the next administration. I know we will, if it's the right one. Consumers have come to expect, of course, when it comes to the internet, an open and neutral internet. That's always been the hallmark of it. And the movement for internet freedom is tapping the same American spirit that fueled the movement against media consolidation. The beauty of the internet is that nobody's in charge and everybody's in charge. Its open nature has enabled those with unique interests and needs to form virtual communities like no tool before it. We've certainly seen it in this campaign. It's empowered consumers as citizens, as active participants in democracy, and as entrepreneurs. In an age when traditional media is dominated by a handful of giant conglomerates, there's optimism in my book about the rise of broadband. And all those bloggers downstairs and those who came up here understand the power to communicate. There's a sense that it can restore the decentralized, locally rooted, and entrepreneurial voices to the American media landscape that are reflective of the best aspects of the American media before the rise of consolidation. So we need greater competition in broadband. We need to make sure that we stop this dramatic consolidation in broadband providers and find some new broadband providers. That's the best guarantor of keeping the internet open. But it's also up to the FCC, as we did in the Comcast BitTorrent decision, to make sure that we make the decisions that will ensure the internet remains open. And we need to improve our policy statement. We need to make it more than a policy statement. We need to make it an actual policy of the FCC. And we need to add a fifth principle to our policy statement that addresses the incentives for anti-competitive discrimination. Consumers want that. The FCC owes it to them to keep the internet open. So the road to media democracy doesn't just begin with us at the Commission. It begins with all of you and what we're doing here today. So we really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I want to reclaim the media to preserve the greatness of our democracy. This is how we do it. with fewer media companies controlling what Americans see, hear, and read, we're going to make sure that we restore public interest obligations, that we strengthen our democracy, that we keep the internet open so that all of these voices can be heard. And each of you is part of this national dialogue, and I can't emphasize enough the importance of your participation, your involvement, and I thank you for letting me be a small part of it here today.
Jonathan, a number of these folks have questions, and we have very little time, but you served Tom Daschle when he was the majority leader. You served with Harry Reid and with Don Riegel, one of my friends, so you know a lot about politicians, and you're supporting Obama's effort to become the next president of the United States. One of the reasons we don't have a huge audience here is that there's a competing event taking place. We've seen in the Obama campaign the dramatic use of the internet and free media to get words out, both in his messaging and in his fundraising. Just describe very briefly the competing event that is drawing some of your attention right now.
Well, just over this morning at the Silicon Flatirons event is having a lot of the luminaries of the telecom world are discussing the future of broadband and remarking on the fact that in the last 8 years we don't think that George Bush and Dick Cheney ever discussed the word broadband in all of that time. There's been a complete absence of leadership on national broadband policy. Not only making sure the internet's open, but making sure that everybody has access to it in an affordable way, that there's competition. So there's been this 8-year hiatus after this incredible boom of telecommunications policy in the late 90s. A lot of the old Clinton folks are over there discussing what they were doing, how they had a vision of competition and openness and broadband, and how it's basically been on hold for 8 years, and how we're hoping to bring back that spirit of entrepreneurialism, that spirit of developing broadband for everybody in this country. And how we're going to do that, there's so many great minds in this campaign that are really experienced, that led the development of the policy in the 90s, that led to this real explosion of interest in the internet and the development of it. And we need to get those people back at work, really addressing the needs of this country for broadband. I don't know if we're 15th or 16th today, depends where Latvia is, I guess. But we better make sure that we become number one, the leader in technology.
Jonathan, there is a very bad joke about George Bush thinking that he was going to get the broadband to play the national anthem, but that's a bad joke. Dan Rather is going to be on this stage at noon today, and he's going to speak to this audience. He, I think, has epitomized the need for the diversity in the media. Also, in the New York Times, there's a editorial writer by the name of Frank Rich who mildly took issue with Obama's time for a change theme, and he said, change before it's too late. Are there some issues in the media area that we need to address before it's too late?
I think we do. I mean, as the media consolidates, opportunities are forever taken away from people to be able to participate, to own their own outlets. And we're seeing the, for example, newspaper broadcast cross-ownership ban weakened by the FCC. I think that we need to revisit that before there are transactions that can result in additional consolidation. There haven't been any yet, and that's partly because the environment is one where they know they're going to go into a buzzsaw if they try it. But if we don't get the right outcome here, then I'm afraid that we could see a wave of consolidation, because the waiver policy is so loose. I call it like a wet noodle. If 3 commissioners agree, you can waive it, and there could be a newspaper buying a broadcast outlet in any community in the United States. So before that happens, I think we need to revisit that rule. We need to make sure that we have an FCC that stands up and doesn't allow those waivers unless they're really justified, which in my view, they almost never would be. So that's an urgent issue for media democracy. Net neutrality, of course. We can't afford to let the internet become like old media. We have to stop that before it happens. Once we begin to lose the freedoms on the internet, it'll be too late. And there's privacy issues that are enormous, that are, we have large companies wanting to do deep packet inspection. before our privacy is taken away, we need to make sure that we have policies in place to deal with that.
That's great. Dr. Martin Luther King said that there is an urgency of now. And because of the time pressures, before we close, you have some questions out there. And this young lady tells me I have a couple more minutes. Let me ask if you would raise your questions, and our commissioner will briefly give a closing response to as many of your questions as possible, and then we'll get off the stage for the next panel. But what are your questions? Stand up quickly and I'll try to repeat them. Your question loudly.
Yes, sir. My name is James Johnson. I just had a question for you. You speak about discrimination and working against the discrimination in the media. I wanted to ask you, what is the FCC prepared to do to end discrimination in media against minor party candidates and third-party candidates?
Okay. We'll get that question answered in just a second. Minor party candidates, what's the FCC going to do? Other questions? Other questions? Your question. Give us your name real quick and your question.
David Sullins. In the 1980s, there was a question of state regulation of cable TV companies, price and quality. Never seen such a flood of lobbyists on the state scene to fight against that. And it seems the same thing is true today. So I know we're encouraged by the thought that the administration would change, but it seems like they're just going to carry that huge straw from one side of the aisle to the other one and slop a new set of hogs. And so I guess my question is, what can we really do to fight the massive amount of money that's invested in keeping things the way they are and making them worse?
Money in politics is something Common Cause is interested in, but we'll let the commissioner answer that question. Any other questions? Commissioner, those two questions are important, but before you answer them, let me thank the staff for putting together this whole day of symposiums and actions. Those who are part of the staff, do you want to stand quickly and we'll recognize you who work so hard? Jonathan, give them a round of applause. See them if you want to know about the workshops that are going to be held later today.
Well, from an FCC perspective, we don't have a lot of authority over the third-party candidate issue. We really, there's a thing called the First Amendment, which I deeply revere. The idea is that if there can be a diversity of voices, that everybody will get heard. I mean, the problem is we have such consolidation in media that there isn't really an opportunity for diverse voices to be heard. The idea of the FCC, because of the First Amendment, we try to control and deal with diversity through ownership rules, structural ownership rules. Because we've allowed them to go so far, you find that there tends to be a very limited dialogue in the media. And that's why we need to keep the ownership limits on. We need to have a diversity of voices.
And Jonathan, I would say that you should talk with some of us at Common Cause, because we work on trying to provide third-party opportunities, not just in the media, but in debates and other things all across the country. So we can work on that. One final wrap-up question that you were given, which is right here.
Well, you mentioned cable also and the money in politics. I mean, one of the urgent issues that I should have mentioned is public access, because public access is under real and present danger. And this is something that once it gets killed, I'm afraid it's going to be very hard to restore. It's a good thing we have this competition coming from the phone companies, but that good thing is being used to destroy support for public access, which is one way that candidates can get heard. Because if you look at money in politics, if you go on your local public access and have a way of getting out, it's another avenue for politicians and people that want to get involved in serving the public to be heard. And it's being really undercut horribly right now by this video franchise process, and there's no need for that. We need to find a different way to allow competition without destroying public access.
Jonathan's going to be downstairs if anybody wants to talk with him directly and personally before he has to run off to something else. Let me say to all of you, when I speak before audiences throughout this country, I usually get them to chant, "We are the leaders we have been waiting for." And I believe that this time, this season of political activity, we're the leaders we've been waiting for. Let us work together to make sure that we diversify our media. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Bob. It's great to be here.
Thank you.
You said you love me.